Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to Be Happier Today. And I'm Tina Nies, your host on Tuesdays and Fridays as we bring you some really great people talking about love, sex, and happiness, and really digging into some real-life tools and tips and strategies we can use to be happier today. And so I'm really excited to have my friend Rachel Grant joining me today. Hello, Rachel.
Hi. How's it going today, Tina?
It's great. I'm so excited to have you on. And Rachel is the owner and founder of Rachel Grant Coaching, and she is a sexual abuse recovery coach. And it's really important work she does with survivors of childhood sexual abuse who are beyond sick and tired of feeling broken, unfixable, burdened by the past. And she helps them let go of the pain and abuse and finally feel normal. She's also the author of Beyond Surviving, the final stage in recovery from sexual abuse. And I'm just so excited to have you with me because you really are compassionate. And I know Rachel personally, and she's just like a really easygoing person to talk to and work with. And she can use not only coaching models, but therapeutic models, as she has an MA in counseling psychology as well. So welcome, and thank you for joining me today, Rachel.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me and for that lovely introduction.
Well, you're welcome. And, I know you have done a lot of different work, and how did you kind of arrive to this place where you are now to specialize in trauma recovery coaching?
Yeah, it has been a bit of a windy road, to be sure. And I would say really what landed me here is just from my own journey in wanting to recover from sexual abuse. I was abused by my grandfather when I was 10 years old. And as many survivors experience, I kind of was terrified and scared and didn't really know what was going on at the time of the abuse. And when it was discovered and my parents kind of wanted me to get some help, I, on the other hand, wanted to just put my head in the sand and pretend that nothing was going on, like everything is fine here, nothing to see. And, I ended up doing that for about 20 years. But, of course, the consequence was that I was walking through the world pretty wounded and angry and feeling very different and alone a lot of the time. So around the time of my early 20s, I decided enough of this. I'm tired of feeling this way. I'm tired of having difficulty in my relationships and feeling angry all the time and just depression and all of that. So I went to a counselor like we do. I started doing the things to try to get better. And after a couple of years of talking about what had happened, and making some connections and understanding, why I threw Tupperware and got so angry and these sorts of things. And I was like, okay, great, that's all good, but now what do I actually do to move on? How do I actually get past this and stop just surviving my life, but actually start living it? And I kept getting these deer-in-the-headlight looks every time I would start pushing in that direction. And I thought, what's going on here? Why does nobody have an answer to this question? And so being the stubborn redhead that I am, I decided, well, let me see if I can figure it out. So it was really that gap and that my own frustration of, getting tired of just talking about what was going on and not getting any resources, skills, or tools for how to do that. So I did my master's in counseling psychology. I also picked up kind of the hobby of neuroscience, not that that's the coolest hobby one can have, but, it turned out to be like a really amazing frame from which to begin understanding how abuse impacts us, and particularly the brain, and why recovery can be so difficult sometimes because of what is happening in the brain. And so all of that, plus my own experience, I just kind of started using myself as a guinea pig and thinking, okay, well, in this area of life, what do I need to know and understand, like in the area of relationships, okay, in the area of communication, in the area of self-worth? What has to shift or change for me to actually be free and feel like I'm living my life unburdened, full of joy, connected, confident. And ultimately, the Beyond Surviving program is the culmination of that work. And that's kind of how I ended up, in this world of sexual abuse recovery coaching, and kind of stuck my, stick in the ground to say this is for those people who are ready for that next stage and really are ready to move on with their lives.
Right. I love that. I think that's, one of the reasons that we easily connect as well is because a very similar experience. And a lot of times, too, like what you said, when people did find out, when I had been sexually abused and people found out a few years later, I didn't want to talk about it either. It's like, okay, they might try and force you, but if you're not ready, you're not ready. That's right. So, and then we kind of stumble, right? Finding our way. Yeah, and I love that. So I love that you've really pulled together, some of those things that you've experienced in doing that. So how have you found that, sexuality in particular, because that's such a personal thing, and there's so many other issues like happiness or loving ourselves and all that, but how is sexuality itself impacted by this abuse?
Well, when we think about, ourselves as human beings with different aspects and different components of our lives, sex is a huge component. And when our first experiences, or at any point an experience of abuse enters into the realm of sex, it begins to skew our perspective about what it should feel like, what our options are, what the purpose and use is of sex. And so all of these different, our ability to just be in our body, how we show up as a sexual being, the list is very long, and even just how we can we talk about sex? Can we feel comfortable, being around others, even flirting or doing the things that lead up to sex, right? Can you go out on dates? Can you make eye contact? So oftentimes the focus tends towards just what happens, in the bedroom, like the actual physical act of sexuality, where people maybe disassociate or go into PTSD or have flashbacks. And that's all very, very important and very much an aspect of our sexuality that's impacted by abuse. But I think there's also these other components that oftentimes don't get addressed and don't get acknowledged. And for me, I think they're also very, very foundational. So, when I'm working with clients, sex is kind of one of those topics we get to later in the program after we've done a lot of work around clearing out negative beliefs about the self, and also developing communication skills, being able to set boundaries. All of those pieces are so important to have in place because they are actually a part of this journey of sexuality. You need all of that to actually end up in the place of enjoying sex.
Yeah, that's so true, and it's just sometimes overwhelming almost when you think about an abuse of any type, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse. They all tie in together so much into just this core of who we are, and the more I talk about it with people, because we do similar work with a different focus, is that I don't know if I've met anybody who hasn't been affected in some way by some form of abuse, whether it's to themselves or in their family or someone else. And it's really tough with as common, unfortunately, as this is, that we have such a hard time really even opening up and talking about it.
Yeah, exactly so. Exactly so. And, another thought that comes to mind to just distinguish for, men and women, that there's a lot in common. But I know a lot of my male clients deal with the added component, especially if their abuser was a man, of their, sexual orientation. And, does this mean that I'm gay? How do I deal with that? A lot of men then overcompensate and have just tons and tons of sex, and then they feel guilty about that. Many of my male clients, because they're having a difficult time connecting with their, live partner, end up turning to pornography. which, pornography has a great place in relationships, and fantasy and all of that really can come in to relationships. But when you're using it as a replacement tool, as opposed to an enhancement tool, is,
right.
that's where the problems, start to lie, and so I just want to distinguish that. And, for women, too, actually, sexual orientation can also be a question when the abuser is a female. So just even in that, like, what kind of sex do I like? Am I turned on by this because I'm actually turned on by this? Or am I turned on by this because I somehow got programmed to like it or want it because of the abuse? And kind of untangling that and is one of those things that takes a little bit of work, but definitely doable.
Absolutely. And it's almost a conversation we could have every day for the next 20 years and never even cover all of these little aspects.
I know.
Because there's so much to it. And you're right, there's so many different areas about how we feel about ourselves and relate to other people. And I love what you say, too, about that. Am I attracted to that, or am I programmed to that, or, what it is? Because sometimes we get something stuck in our head, and you might have this with some of your clients as well. That thing gets stuck in their head, whether it's good, bad, indifferent, a turn on, not wanting to be turned on, whatever. And then that in itself causes a whole another realm of issues that we're unable to really express in a personal relationship. And
agree.
It's just it's something I hope, in talking in our Let's Talk About Whatever series, that we can just talk about these things. So, like, if someone's listening and they might have one of those things, and maybe they're a survivor of abuse, and what would be, something that they could start to think about? And maybe they've never talked to anybody about it before, or maybe they have a little bit, but it hasn't been successful. And some first steps they might do if they're just listening right now and hearing themselves in our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the very first things to start with is just exploring the messages that you were given or the lessons that you learned about sex growing up. Not even just from the abuse, but just overall, right? Like what were, when mom and dad talked about sex, if they talked about sex at all, right? Or was it hush-hush, or did you never, all of that. And then, specifically then drilling into, as a result of the abuse, what lessons, what messages did I get about my body, about sexuality, about sex acts that maybe I need to now take a second look at and challenge and decide. Sometimes I describe it like these old telegrams that you've received. Maybe it's time to take those and throw them in the trash because they're no longer applicable to your life. For example, one experience I had with my grandfather was there was this moment where I was actually, trying to push him away. And he said to me, just let me play with you. And that experience, my interpretation of that, my way of trying to make sense of that was to almost begin to believe of myself as an object, think of myself as an object, like a toy. Right? I'm just here to be played with and objectified, and sex for me, certainly through my teens and early 20s, was so much about that. It was just about being an object, being there for the satisfaction of another person, right? And so when I was able to let go of that message and realize the fundamental flaw and lie of that message is when I was able to start, being a participant and showing up in the bedroom with my lovers and enjoying sex from my own needs, my own desires, and still be pleasing and caring towards them, but it wasn't that one-way road anymore. So that's certainly the very first critical, step. The next thing to recognize, it's almost like just an awareness thing, not even a doing thing, is just to understand the error that we often make is to blame sex instead of the abuser for what happened.
Right.
And so as a result of that, we continue to connect like what we experienced at the hands of our abuser with the experiences we're now having as adults, right?
Yeah.
We think sex is bad, sex is the problem, because sometimes it even comes down to gender, like me being a girl is a problem, right? Or me being a boy is a problem. So when you're ready, when you're noticing that and you're ready to really step into reclaiming your sex life, distinguishing and separating the sex that occurred during the abuse from our sex life as adults is important. And there's one key distinction that for me made all the difference, made that really possible, really drove it home for me. And that was to notice that when I was being abused, there was one major thing that was missing, and that's consent.
Mhm. Yep.
So what ended up making a big difference for me and helped me start separating the sexuality that occurred when I was abused from my sexuality as an adult was to recognize the difference between sex as obligation and sex as choice.
Yeah.
Because while we didn't have any, go ahead. Yeah, right? It's such a key distinction. And so what's beautiful is that as adults, we have the right to choose. We have all sorts of freedom and autonomy to choose when we're going to have sex, who we're going to have sex with, how we're going to have sex, what we're going to say, what we're going to, sound like, all of that.
Right.
Yeah. And so that is like just getting that connection just opens up the door. It's like, oh, wow, wait a minute here. Like this person, touching me on my thigh where my abuser used to touch me, like that's not my abuser, that's my lover. Yeah, and and really thinking through that, and making that separate disconnection. Like I'm not obligated for this person to let this person touch me here. I'm choosing to let this person touch me here. One of my clients, when she started the program, she hadn't had sex with her husband for 3 years. Barely any physical contact, even like cuddling. They just kind of had completely disconnected physically. And, as we worked the program and got, through those foundational stages and pieces that are important, and we started working more into the physicality and sexuality, we started very, very small. It was like just sit on the couch next to him, right? And if it was like 5 feet that you needed, start there. And then next week we'll do 3 feet. And next week we'll do 2 feet. We'll just keep inching closer to him, Okay, great. Now you're just going to practice like holding his hand and like being with that and feeling his hand and really consciously looking at like this is his hand, this is not my abuser, looking into his eyes, this is my lover, this is my husband. And by the end of the program, they were having sex, and great sex at that. So,
yay. That's so important. Like, right. And what you said is that they started where they were. If she needed 5 feet, take 5 feet. And I think sometimes I find that too, and maybe you do. Like people want to hurry up and get to the I just want to be fixed, and it's not that easy. I mean, but it doesn't have to be hard. We can start wherever we are, little by little, and take that step, and each step as you go. I love that. That's really beautiful. I was working with a woman too who hated that her husband had pornography, and he might watch it, and she would find it, and she'd be just absolutely just think it's the most evil thing in the world. But what he didn't know is that she had been kidnapped and raped and forced to look at pornography. So her view of pornography, he didn't know that. So he's kind of like, what do you mean it's like evil? He's just thinking of it as like you said, it's just like a tool, and then for whatever it is. And until they were able to talk about it and have an understanding, like, okay, I understand why that is that way. And she could maybe talk about it and open up about it and be able to let it go of it not being that's not why he's watching it, And it's just sometimes there's things that we just have no idea about, but then in the relationship, like they weren't having sex either. And it's and you got to start wherever you are with whatever it is and just keep moving forward. And we definitely get things stuck in our head, don't we, about sex or ourself. And it's just
I mean, and even just for people who haven't been abused, early exposure is, that movie that you watched that had that first sexy woman in it or the first sexy guy, like, that sticks with you, and shapes kind of what turns you on and, what kinks you might have or, what gets you going the most. So, it's not even, so I guess in some ways it's like normalizing for survivors to understand that it's just all a part of it, but you can begin choosing differently if you feel that there's a different choice that needs to be made, right? And so I know, one client of mine felt, kind of awkward or dirty or strange because she liked, certain things in bed. And, when we really got down to it, it was like, well, do you like that because of the abuse, or is that just what you like? She was like, oh, like I didn't even know that was a choice. Right?
Totally.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Because we might have things, like you said, that stick with us for our first experiences, good or bad or indifferent, that are a little bit of a turn on. And sometimes there's so much guilt and shame, even in people who have been abused, because maybe there was a turn on to that experience, which was really just our natural body reaction to stimulus. And so it doesn't mean that we're bad because we might have even learned to enjoy some of the activity, or some of it made our body feel a certain way, that, it's like you said, as we get older, we then get to choose. Like at the time, we didn't get to choose about that experience, but now we do, and decide, like you said, is it something that really does, or is it just something that, we were?
Yeah, and I think a component of this that is a kind of an underlying piece here is when you're being touched sexually, you're going to respond. Your body is going to turn on. Men often have orgasms. Women have orgasms when they're being abused. You feel, excited. And it can be distressing, right? Because you're thinking, well, here's this bad thing that's happening, and yet my body is still responding. And there can be a lot of guilt and shame, or there can be self-blame, thinking, well, I guess, I had an orgasm, or I felt good, so maybe I actually enjoyed it, or I really wanted it, or, that kind of thinking that gets in there, that needs to kind of be scooped out, kind of cleared out, because your body is just doing what your body is supposed to do, right? And so there's nothing that you could do to stop it, from responding to sexual touch. And I think what happens a lot of times, why men or women then turn off, is because in some ways we do have a lot more choice as adults to some extent, and so we can shut down things. Right? So it's like I didn't have a choice then to shut down and not feel. So now today I'm going to shut down and not feel. It's almost like a reverse reclaiming of an experience, And so we want to get out of that, because, that's the kind of like trap that we fall into that leads us to miss out on, what's really beautiful about coming together with another person and, being open, being vulnerable, having a good time, laughing, joking, goofing off in bed. I mean, it's the whole spectrum, right?
Right. And it's so interesting. A few minutes ago you were talking about, like you eventually going to a therapist, and you work through some things, but nobody's really telling you then how to do that next step. Like, okay, I might know that it wasn't my fault. I might be able to forgive myself. I might be able to do that. But then how do we really move to that next step of just loving ourselves in a way to be playful and reclaim our sexuality in a more, I don't want to say happy way, but, to feel good about it, really feeling good about our sexuality rather than it even having anything. And I think that's what's great about your program, and is that it takes you to that next step, not just, okay, I'm going to, get over this piece, I'm going to recover from this experience, but how do I then thrive into who I can really be? So, I love that about, beyond surviving. I love that it's called that, because you don't want to just survive the experience. You really want to just, have so much more. So why don't you I know we only have a few more minutes left. And I know that you also have the first part of your book available free, and there's a link as they're listening to the show right now, they can click on and get that. So how did you really get into your program Beyond Surviving, and what is a little bit about that program?
Right. So, the Beyond Surviving program is really about taking everything that I've learned and developed and what's worked for me, quite honestly, and put it into, an easy-to-approach, step-by-step kind of guide and roadmap for people who are, sick and tired of just talking about the abuse, understanding it, making connections, and they're really ready to, shed all of the lies, all of the junk, and show up in the world as what I call kind of their genuine self. One of the things that I think about a lot is how abuse just kind of puts this layer on top of us. And a lot of the work of recovery is just about stripping all that away so like your best, most wonderful self can show up in the world, including like your sexual self, right? Your best, most amazing, sexy sexual self. And so it's essentially an 8-month program, and I work with my clients by phone and by Skype, which is awesome because I get to work with people around the world and around the country. And we use the roadmap as the guidebook as kind of our roadmap for the work that we're going to do. And I spent a lot of time thinking about, the order in which information should come and which lessons should happen first, knowing that a lot of the mistakes that happen in recovery are trying to jump into a topic too soon, too early, without those foundational pieces in place. So it's really about stripping away, learning those techniques for identifying those lies, and then most importantly, challenging them, what to do about them. And then really dealing with guilt and shame and the belief that it was your fault. We do a lot of work around the emotional life, releasing things, feelings like anger and loneliness and the fear of abandonment. And then, of course, the relationship piece is so critical, and working on like trust and intimacy and vulnerability and sex. So, all of those things come together so that ultimately at the end of the program, my clients are, choosing for themselves what their life is going to look like. They're able to communicate. They're able to stand confident in who they are. One of my favorite stories is one of my clients when we started the program, we actually said, okay, there's a lot here that I really like and I really want to get, but when we get to the relationship stuff, like I'll do it if you want me to do it, but I'm like determined. I'm not going to be in a relationship ever again. I'm just giving up. I'm done. Too much hurt, too much pain, too much trouble. He's now been in a 1-year relationship and they live together.
Aww. Because sometimes when you haven't, like you said, the order that you do them, there was no way that was even a thought until he built that foundation in himself. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's so important. It's so true. Because, and you can always say, okay. But by the time you get to that, you're like, oh, okay, I'm ready for this.
Okay, here it is. Yeah. So anyone who's, curious or wants to learn more or wants to explore if, the Beyond Surviving program is their best next step, I really welcome you to set up a Discover Your Genuine Self session with me, just 60 minutes where we'll come together. We'll look at where you're at today, where you want to go, and really figure out if this is the best next step. And if not, then I'll point you towards the resources that I think would be of help to you. And you can sign up for that or get scheduled for that from my website by going to the services page. There's a calendar there at the bottom. And then I'd love to see you on my calendar and get a chance to talk with you.
Yes. Yay. That's so great. So you can click right on it on the link right there, and it is RachelGrantCoaching.com, correct?
Yeah.
Yep, and the link is right here. So thank you so much for joining me today, Rachel. It was really great to kind of just talk about some of these topics around our sexuality, and I hope that everybody will take you up on that and visit your website and get that information. So,
absolutely. Thank you, Tina, for having me.
Thank you. And I hope everybody has a really wonderful weekend. And join us again next week. Thank you, Rachel.
You're welcome. Take care, everyone.